Hello, everyone. Welcome today to our webinar. We're going to give our audience just one additional quick minute to get logged in. We have a pretty large group today, so we'll be starting here in about the next 30 seconds. Okay, again, thank you, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webcast. My name is Dina Evans, and I'm the Marketing and Special Events Manager here at Looking Glass Cyber Solutions. So I want to welcome you to our today's presentation, which is Bigger Isn't Always Better, Assessing Cyber Risk to Reduce Your Attack Surface. And your Looking Glass presenters for today's session are, we have Eric Olson, who is our Vice President of Intelligence Operations, and we have James Carnell, who's the Vice President of our Cybersecurity Center. Before we start and kick off the webcast, I want to run through a few very quick housekeeping notes for the Bright Talks webinar platform. Please note that there is a chat feature on the right side of your viewer screen. Feel free to submit any questions that you may have through that portal, through that window. Because our audience members today are all muted, there will not be an audio for your side, so if you have any questions, be sure to enter them there in the chat screen. We'll try to address all the questions at the end of today's session, but if for some reason we happen to run out of time, we'll be sure to contact you directly following the presentation and make sure that you get your questions answered. So also please note that any questions that are submitted through that feature, those are only viewed by our presenters today and not fellow audience members. So if you have any confidential questions or anything that you prefer to address one-on-one, please indicate that. We'll make sure to address it directly after the presentation. Also note one more item. On the section to the right, there's an attachments and links section. Please feel free to peruse those items listed there. We have a few of our data sheets as well as one of our latest blogs I'd like for you to take a look at. So for now, without any further delay, at this time, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Eric and James, who will kick off today's webcast. Eric?
Thank you, Dina. James here. Again, I appreciate everybody for joining us today. Bigger isn't always better. Assessing cyber risk to reduce your attack surface is the topic for today. And like always, Eric and I like to begin with some signposts. Just like when you get on the airline, you know, they don't close the door before they tell you we're actually flying, so you got enough time to get off the plane. We want to make sure that you know. So we'll go through a little bit more of an introduction for you. We're going to go through a definition. Again, one of the things that Eric and I love to do is actually define what it is that we think we're talking about, so you understand it better. We'll go through the 3 types of attack surface as we define it for you today. 3 tiers of intelligence, and we'll explain what that means. And again, with every webinar, we want you to walk away with some practical tips for you. So again, we'll do that for you. Eric will leave us with a final thought, and then we'll do a Q&A. So with that, let's move on to the introduction. Again, my name is James Carnell. I'm the Vice President of the Cybersecurity Center. That's the center here at Looking Glass that takes care of our phishing detection and mitigation, trademark, rogue mobile app, and threat monitoring and detection. I've been here for 12 years, and thank you very much for joining us today. And with that, I'll head over to Eric.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Olson. I run intelligence operations for Looking Glass. I have been in this company or its predecessors for, that is the threat intel business overall. I've been in 18 years this year. And this is a webinar about today's topic, not about the company, but in less than 60 seconds, for those not familiar with Looking Glass, we are a broad-spectrum cybersecurity company with a wide portfolio of products and services. The core thread running through all of them is that we believe that intelligence makes security better. And James and I have done many an episode of the Eric and James show here on what that means in real terms. But generally speaking, we provide threat intelligence services, threat detection, round-the-clock human-vetted alerting, response removal and takedown services, bespoke investigations, threat actor profiles, and the like. We also produce a lot of machine threat intelligence in the form of high-fidelity data feeds, both customer-specific and broadly applicable. We provide software and platforms that can ingest our threat intelligence and others for things like analysis, incident response, and threat mitigation, as well as orchestration for the devices, gateways, appliances, firewalls, ours and other people's, to mitigate those threats in the network layer. And as James mentioned, his group is the 24/7 shop that never sleeps. They also do threat removal, response, and takedown for things on the web. So that's just 60 seconds on who Looking Glass is if you don't know us.
And that's why we're talking to you today as well. So with that, let's move into our definition. So Eric, again, attack surface, that's a big surface in some cases, right? It's the known, it's the unknown, it's the physical threats, it's the network threats. It can be a lot of things for a lot of individuals, organizations, things like that.
Absolutely, and as James alluded to earlier, we like to start with a definition as a cure for buzzword bingo, we call it. We've done episodes on threat intelligence and intelligence-led security, and I think we're doing one on the dark web coming up. You know,
very sexy.
Lots of stuff gets thrown around, and a lot of people go, yeah, that. What does that mean again?
Yeah.
So for the purpose of today's discussion, James is exactly right. An organization's attack surface is actually much larger than just the traditional IT or InfoSec definition. As an intelligence provider, not a network security provider, right, we see the attack surface as everything that presents a risk to the business. This can include physical disruptions to operations, from everything from weather events to terrorism. It includes risks to reputation and brand, trademarks. There's a legal and compliance and HR, but for the purpose of today's webinar, we are going to focus a little more specifically on the traditional network-centric definition or meaning of attack surface, which I will define as the various means and exposures by which an attacker could enter, modify, or exfiltrate data from the computing environment. In other words, for today's purposes, we are talking about how people get in, change stuff, or take stuff out.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Eric.
Great.
All right, so let's move on to the three types of attack surface. Now, again, you've got down here, we've got networks, which is the plumbing.
Yep.
We've got the application, which is the OS, the software part of it, and then we've got the human, which is the user, or as I call it, the weakest link.
Absolutely, the weakest link. And this is a really important point. In fact, I just today added a few words to this slide because this siloing, this differing perspectives on attack surface is really important depending on your role. If you ask a network guy about attack surface, he goes, oh, we're all patched and everything's up to date on our routers and our gateways and everything else. If you ask an application layer guy or gal about their attack surface, right, completely different meaning.
Right.
And often the people with the responsibility to mitigate or reduce that attack surface, right, at the network layer versus the application layer, different people, different departments, different responsibilities, may or may not talk well together and play well together.
Yep.
And the human part of the attack surface is almost entirely forgotten in many organizations, even though it is the hardest to patch and the weakest link in the chain.
Well, with that, let's talk about the network aspect of the vulnerability, right? Where we talk about the 7 layers, right? That acronym, like all people seem to need data processing, whatever you do, to remember that.
Yep, your traditional 7-layer stack, or the 7-layer cake, I call it. Right. So, again, if you talk to a networking person, they go, oh, yeah, I understand network vulnerabilities. This is the stuff that affects, for those who are familiar with the stack, roughly speaking, there's some nuances, but we consider network-level vulnerabilities to be those that exist below the application layer. This is at your protocol layer, your transport layer, even your physical layer. Actually, the picture on the right of this slide is a great one.
Right?
Yep, the ATM. I actually got this from Brian Krebs, whose blog, Krebs on Security.
Right, very good.
Something I read often, and we've spoken to him many times over the years. Because people are learning to look for faceplate skimmers on ATMs, criminals have created this little 2-inch thing, which is nothing but a LAN jack and a LAN cable about 1 inch long, and they insert it in the LAN cable between the ATM and the wall jack. Now, that is literally a physical layer 1 interdiction of information. But the breaches that, the vulnerabilities that often make the big press, that people hear about in the newspaper, even non-technical people, the heartbleeds, the poodles. I do like the vulnerability called breach. They went right to the point.
Very specific.
Browser reconnaissance and exfiltration via adapted compression of hypertext.
Wow.
Let's just call it the breach vulnerability, right? Okay. So the point is that these are a lot of the vulnerabilities that you hear about in the news, and these are SSL protocol vulnerabilities. These are in the transport layer. This is down in the plumbing, networking, IT guy kind of stuff.
The average user is not going to know this is happening or experiencing it at all. Right?
Or have any ability to influence it at all. Right. Correct.
All right, so now we're going to the application, the OS or the software that we're interacting with.
Absolutely. So I thought I'd start with a very, very simple example, because when we talk about attack surface, right, it's not all people with IT or CS degrees turning knobs on complicated things. One of the easiest ways to attack at the application layer is through the misuse of username and password credentials. Okay. So let me give a very simple, very low-tech example of your vulnerability or your attack surface at the application layer. If you work in an organization that uses Microsoft Outlook and you want to have web access, so you don't have to have your desktop, your company workstation, you can go to the web and get your mail. At least in some of the older versions, if you're not on 365 yet, the default is OWA, online web access, owamail.yourcompanydomain.com/exchange. Well, most people don't change defaults. You can go to Google, find URLs with that in it, and with some very simple searching online, you can actually find people who have sold, traded, offered, found, uploaded, or downloaded, or shared large packages of breach data where they've got usernames and compromised passwords. Now, at Looking Glass, we've aggregated and automated this process. We've got 4 billion stolen credentials in a database. So I literally went to Google, found an OWA mail URL or a hospital.
Lovely.
Did a quick search for user credentials, found 76 people at that hospital, and I could literally just start typing for dollars.
Hospitals don't have sensitive information, do they?
Not at all. and my point is that, you know, if there is an attack surface here that is not being properly addressed, I don't get locked out after 4 failed attempts, etc., right? I'm going to get in sooner or later, and sooner maybe missed.
Right. So despite the risk of being able to get onto SAP or Workday or Salesforce or any other service with the same credentials that you've got, what you're saying is that the application responsibility here from a programming point of view is, you know, I've got to try 3 times and then I fail, and every 90 days I have to change the policies to change my password, or don't reuse old passwords. These are all programmable aspects of the application.
Absolutely. These are parts of the attack surface. These are vulnerabilities that can be exploited. This is a very simple example. To be more specific about, you know, the bigger picture, here we have just 2 quick graphics to kind of make the key points. One is the OWASP Top 10. That's the Open Web Application Security Project. Basically, folks who look at the vulnerabilities in web applications at the software, not the network layer, and say these are the worst, the most common, the ways the bad guys are actually doing things, and how bad things actually happen. So the top 10 list on the left, they've just put out 2017. It's a 70% overlap from the one 4 years ago, which was like a 70% overlap from the one from 2010.
That's a rerun. We've seen this movie.
Exactly. And the point is, these problems don't go away, and they're incredibly well known. I saw a remarkable statistic from a company called Skybox Security. They said 90+% of all breaches that happen through a vulnerability are vulnerabilities for which the CVE, the notification that the vulnerability was known and exists and could be fixed, had been out for a year before the breach. The graphic on the right is from the SANS Institute. They do a survey of people who are actually checking their own network. So the OWASP folks are saying, you know, here are the things that are the worst and you need to be on the lookout for. And on the right, SANS is saying, so what do you actually find when you check your own organizations? It's overwhelmingly the same list, and the numbers are huge. 80% of respondents find these problems. 60% of the respondents find these problems. And they're all the problems that everybody already knows about.
So if you're building software applications, you probably want to be aware of these organizations and the common vulnerabilities.
Absolutely.
So then we want to move into the human part of the problem, right? The attack surface.
Exactly.
When it comes to human.
You used the exact right phrase, James. These are absolutely the weakest links in the chain. The thing to know, first of all, and I use the Google OWA mail example, but I mean, people are even worse in the sense that it's become so effective to spearfish, to craft a message that will be absolutely believable or a prompt or response. This campaign shown on the left where, you know, a malicious attachment, a subpoena,
right.
It goes to the EA for the CEO. It says, you're being sued. Everything about it, details, it's all believable. They panic and open the attachment.
Right.
They forward it to the CEO. They panic and open the attachment. They send it to the general counsel to deal with. They open the attachment. And now I'm into the 3 most valuable computers in the building, right?
Yeah.
So the Primera and Anthem, 2 large healthcare companies hacked in like a 6-week period, lost 92 million records between them. All it took was a lookalike domain name with 1 instead of an L or an RN instead of an M, and an email that looked like it came from a very important person, a known person at that company,
right.
to someone who said, oh, it's my boss, and click, and that was the ball game.
It's a very low-tech way of getting it.
Incredibly low-tech. In fact, I love showing this slide when I speak at conferences. It's as simple as that lookalike domain or sending a spoofed email, and a lot of people go, well, I don't know how to send a spoofed email. And my answer is, don't worry about it. There's a 5-minute YouTube that will teach you how to do it. And this, speaking of buzzword bingo, business email compromise,
right.
This is not low-tech. This is no-tech. This is, dear accounts payable clerk, I'm the CEO who's traveling on a trip to China, which they tweet about, so you know that's where they are. And this vendor is very angry. Please, their invoice is overdue. Please wire them $50,000 right away, or you're fired. And out goes the $50,000, and never to be heard from again. The smartest, quote, tech companies in the world have lost tens of millions of dollars to these types of no-tech scams.
Right, and typically the people they're targeting are not technical people, right? They're in the accounts or HR or what have you. So they're using computers, but they're not doing IT security. They're not, you know, developing applications themselves. Exactly right.
And the traditional view of attack surface says, oh, I've got my network vulnerabilities, I've got my application vulnerabilities. Patch the Heartbleed and check the OWASP list, right? And we're good, except that if you're not addressing the human layer, it's layer 8 in the stack, right?
Right.
You're not mitigating some of the most effective tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, that the bad guys are using. They know everybody's getting better. Better is relative, but they know everybody's getting better at the layer 7 and down. Layer 8 is a huge part of the attack surface.
And that's a culture and training thing that you'll get into for us a little bit. All right, so we're going to change gears a little bit. So we're moving from the 3 attack type surfaces, what we talked about, right, network, application, and human, and now we're moving into the intelligence tiers, right?
Yeah, I mean, for those on the webinar, this probably comes as no surprise, given that we are an intelligence-centric company, right? Parochial view, but we believe very strongly that in all 3 of these areas, all 3 attack canvases, if you will, in our attack surface, can be reduced, the size of that attack surface can be reduced by the application of intelligence.
Right.
And this bell curve here is meant to kind of hammer home, I think, a key point about intelligence. A lot of folks look at attack surface as more or less analogous with vulnerability. So they say if we're doing a vulnerability scan on our network, if we're doing an application scan on our applications, we find where the holes are, we set a patch cadence, we fix the problem, we scan, we patch, we fix, we scan, we patch, we fix.
Right.
Absolutely necessary, core tenet of reducing your attack surface and a well-managed information security program. However, I would argue that the intelligence, the corpus of intelligence that is available has both a left tail and a right tail that are on either side of vulnerability. Vulnerability says you have a known weakness which can be exploited. To the left of that is the early tickle, for lack of a better phrase.
Indicators and warnings.
Indications and warnings, as we call it in the intel biz, right?
Yeah.
Are threat actors talking about you? is a specific vulnerability that you have, the one that is being exploited by threat actor groups that are targeting companies similar to yours? Are you in a peer group of 5 companies, large P&C insurers focused in the North American market? Well, and I'm just picking them out of a hat, right? You know, if Geico got hit last Wednesday, State Farm the Wednesday before, and Allstate the Wednesday before that, you know what? If you're fourth on that list, it's either this Wednesday or next Wednesday.
It's coming down your street.
It's in the mail. And so the early indications and warnings can help with a critical thing we're going to touch on later, which is there's always a long list of vulnerabilities. Every scan gives you a stack of things to worry about.
Where do you start, right?
Where do you start? Which ones do you worry about first? Because one that's medium criticality rated by the people who rate such things, but it's the one that is working and they're using this month, may move to the front of the line, but only if you, ahead of the one that's rated higher but's never been seen. But you will only know to shift that priority of those scarce human resources if you have the early indication and warning.
So let's go to the other side of the tail.
The other tail is, I'm not telling you have a vulnerability that could be exploited. I'm telling you you've been victimized.
Right.
This can take a number of forms. There are structured IOCs, indicators of compromise, or threat data feeds. Looking Glass, for example, runs what we think is the world's largest commercial botnet monitoring and sinkhole platform. If you've got a bunch of infected workstations inside your corporate network and they're talking to a C2 domain that we run, I have declarative evidence that you have infected workstations because they're phoning home looking for a command and control server, only I've taken it over. So I know you're infected. You're calling me.
Right.
The other thing, or an other example, is if someone says, hey, I just breached XYZ company, and here's the data to prove it, right? I've got the blueprints for the stealth fighter. Who wants them? If they show them on the screen, right, you have a good indication that a compromise has actually happened.
And you've got drill-down examples on all 3 of these, so we can look
Yep,
at those.
absolutely. So we're going to take a look at that now.
Okay. So indicators and warnings?
Yep. So this is that early tickle that I was speaking about. If a threat actor is talking in the open source, a lot of threat actors will get on social media and taunt their victims, right? We're coming for you tomorrow.
Coming soon, right.
And they're completely brazen about it.
Right.
Whether it is in an underground forum, an IRC channel, the examples on the screen are doctored to protect the innocent.
But a tweet, as you
this is literally a tweet from the AnonOps Twitter account. Said some company got a sweetheart real estate deal from some city council, and I bet the executives got a sweet deal by evicting little old ladies from their homes of generations.
And that's the hacktivism aspect, the activism coming through.
Absolutely. And they said, so who wants to DDoS this company with me? Who's got 1 million ion cannons in their botnet? Or let's dox the CEO, meaning build a dossier about everything in their personal life and then throw it out on the internet to embarrass them or to prompt others to go throw eggs at their front door or whatever.
Right.
So this is that early indication and warning, which is not touching your network. It's out in the open source. It has nothing to do with your firewall or your software.
Well, and as you're saying, in this case, it's right out there. It's on a tweet, right? And so whether it's a commodity-based activism or whether it's an advanced threat actor, right, they're typically using the same sorts of tools, which just goes into our next area of, you know, proof of vulnerability, maybe.
Yep. So the next step up that ladder, if you will, is do you have a known vulnerability that can be exploited, that actors are known to exploit, that there are kits out there you can download and exploit with one click, even if you don't know how to do any of this stuff, right? And that's where you're the center of that bell curve, that traditional approach to network and application vulnerabilities will tell you these are the things that you have exposed, and if you can combine them with the indications and warning, the open source or customer-specific and actor-specific and industry-specific threat intelligence, you can say, okay, these are rated low, medium, high, critical, informational, but one factor which can, again, alter that critical prioritization of scarce resources is not just the severity of the vulnerability, but its applicability to you.
The likelihood that somebody's going to use it against you, such as a threat actor we talked about in the previous.
Exactly right.
All right, and so now we get into you've been owned, to your point.
Yeah, this is typically, in my experience, identified through some kind of threat intelligence program that does what I think is one of the core objectives of a well-managed threat intel program, which is the correlation of what's going on in here with what's going on out there. There are various ways that this is accomplished. One of the most common is the integration or ingestion of a bunch of third-party governmental, commercial, and community feeds of indicators, bad IP addresses, malware signatures, etc., and overlaying that on the activity on your own network. That'll typically happen in a threat intelligence platform, a TIP as it's called, or a SIM. The one on the screen happens to be our Scout Prime product, but there are many out there. One of the things I like about ours is it's got 80 to 100 feeds kind of pre-integrated, so you don't have to do all that.
Out of the box, right?
Yeah, anything that saves, thousands of lines of Python ingestion scripts is good.
It's a good day.
But the key thing is what that does is when the Venn diagram, the two circles overlap between your network and the bad things the entire community or industry can identify, when those two things overlap and it goes ding, like you see on the screen here, right? This is declarative. Dear user, this IP address, which is part of our network, has been observed on the outside by a sensor or an intel provider as communicating with a specific botnet. That's pretty declarative evidence of a problem. So you've gone through the spectrum from the early warning to the could be an exposure to I'm pretty sure you've got a problem because I'm looking at it.
Very good. Well, as usual in our webinars, Eric, we like to put a movie reference of some type in here. And,
always.
And we've got Bobby Fischer in here, right? Check yourself before you wreck yourself. Again, chess being a strategic game. Why this one?
Well, this one I think makes two relevant points. The first is you're in a constant battle, move and counter move. It's always an arms race with the bad guys. There is no rest for the weary or the IT professional. The second point, though, is the requirement to be proactive. Check yourself. Do not wait for someone else, meaning the bad guy, to find the holes in your posture or to evaluate your attack surface. There are a lot of things that can be done. Some are high-tech, high complexity, et cetera, but many are not. And so let's talk about those, in each of these areas.
So let's go with the practical tips on the network attack surface first.
Okay. So starting back down the stack at that network layer, I attended a conference, and apologies in advance. There are some very technical people in the audience, I know, for today's webinar. But I was at a great conference. I was on a panel with the CTO of a Fortune 100 company, and he stood up and he said two things. One, if you cannot tell me what is on your network and what it's running and what it's talking to, all that fancy schmancy cybersecurity stuff doesn't matter. If you cannot do the basics, that's a problem. The second thing he said was, you would be shocked at the number of companies and organizations who cannot do that first thing. So the ability to do that, again, there are scanners, there are tools, there are products out there. It doesn't necessarily, depending on your environment, it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge lift. But his point was that you cannot do the other things if you cannot answer, what do I have and what is it running?
So once we know that, then it's like, how do we find out what the next exploit is or what's going on out in the marketplace?
Absolutely, and there are some great sources out there. Certainly lots of commercial security companies have their latest vulns, latest exploits pages, but there are some great centralized places you can look. One is the National Vulnerability Database, the nvd.nist.gov. There's a link on the homepage that says, sign up here for alerts, and they'll send you each new thing as the vulnerability is discovered or the CVE is published. exploitdb.com for Windows environments, the Microsoft Tech Center, they're very good about putting out vulnerability information.
So, but you can Google it. And
absolutely.
If you look, you'll find it.
Absolutely. There are a dozen places you can go to sign up for keeping abreast of that information.
Continuous monitoring, right?
Yep. One thing that I think is sometimes overlooked is just network segmentation. A quick touch on that. right? It's not just know where your crown jewels and your sensitive stuff are and who has access to them, but actually segment it, like break it into, right, into separate segments so that there's a much higher bar for an unauthorized user to clear to get access. Continuous monitoring and correlation, that's that tail of the curve, right? Which is if you want to know when you have a problem in real time or near real time, I mean, the Verizon data breach report every year says time to discovery is measured in weeks and time to remediate is measured in months, right? But if you are dynamically, continuously overlaying network traffic and threat indicators, your time to discovery shouldn't be anything like that. Which brings me to my next point, time to remediate.
Yes, instead of the dynamic orchestration and remediation, which sounds like a feature of a Bose sound system. It's really, really cool.
It's noise canceling cybersecurity. So orchestration and remediation, what do I mean by that? Well, if you have high fidelity indicators, one of the reasons the time to remediation is so long, I believe, is that there is a person in the loop, required in the loop, to write a rule, to submit it for approval, to approve the rule, to deploy the rule, right? You know, people, I mean, literally cutting and pasting things in text files and emailing them around to get approvals, and then the guy who knows how to deploy them to the gateways is on vacation, so it's a week before it happens. If you have a high fidelity indicator, example, the Looking Glass C2 domain blacklist. This is like 50,000 domains on any given day that are command and control servers. Unambiguous, no question, incredibly low false positive rate. Anything on your network talking to those domains is a problem, right? Why not automate the orchestration so that the threats that come at line speed are blocked at line speed? There's a lot of things that require humans in the loop, but we've said again and again that talent in this market, you know, we read the newspaper. America is short 100,000 cyber professionals, right? Any place you can squeeze that unnecessary human delay out of the loop and automate orchestration and instant remediation, you have to look for ways to do that.
Very good. And risk management, right?
Yeah, this is where I take off my cyber hat and put on my old hat as an MBA bean counter. Ultimately, I believe that risk management, that business and cyber risk is really about the traditional combination of impact and likelihood, right? So as we touched on with the vulnerabilities, there's a question of severity, there's a question of criticality, there's a question of applicability, right? If there's a huge new problem out there, but it only affects Windows and you're a Linux shop, no problem, right? That's the relevance filter for threat intelligence. The other thing is likelihood, and we talked about there may be a super critical vulnerability that's just come out, except that, you know, you have to be a triple PhD from MIT to use it, and it's never been seen to happen, whereas this buffer overflow or that SQL injection that's been around since 1998 still works, and you haven't patched the hole, right? And if it's getting used all the time, then likelihood versus criticality, you have to prioritize based on risk to the business.
Very good. All right, so let's move on to the practical tips for the application attack surface.
Great. First thing is continuous or regular monitoring of your own posture, just like the network, right? You have to test your own applications regularly. If you're deploying regularly, you're introducing new weaknesses regularly. So you have to stay on top of your own current state and check. Again, as a friend of mine who's a cyber investigator in a Texas police force said to me, most of these guys are not ninjas. Yes, they're the super high-end PhD state actor types, but most of this stuff is being done by exploiting the stuff that is known.
Well, again, the commodity versus the advanced. They're using the same exploits, right?
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly right.
The second thing is secure coding. It's like a manufacturing line. It is so much easier to build the car right than to fix it at the factory door. So there are all kinds of initiatives and best practices and guidelines and white papers for how to build security in when you write the application in the first place. It's so much cheaper to do it right when you build it than after the fact.
And that's essentially a culture thing as well.
Absolutely.
Right? And then anomaly detection.
Yep. This is where your SIM software, your TIP products come into play, right? Which is to look at everything from anomalies in traffic, in patterns, in destination, in user activity. If all of a sudden Eric's login, maybe not Eric, but Eric's login is being used between 2 and 4 in the morning, when Eric never has done that before, that's a warning. My normal data volumes are X megabytes a day, and suddenly they're gigabytes a day. You know, all the things that just smell funny because they are outliers. You've got to have some kind of way to look at that, some kind of way to recognize those anomalies.
This next one, I like this one. Essentially, determine whether you actually need a feature in your application at all in the first place. Yeah,
this was a fascinating one that I, frankly, did not really know about till I started looking at application attack surface. Very simple example is if a search feature on the help function or on your web application or your website allows people to run searches, and that help is often stored in the same database as other materials, right? That search box creates certain vulnerabilities, which an application programmer could tell you about more than I could. Point is, if that help item is only 22 items long, simply put it into a single contiguous page with jump up and jump down links and literally design away the vulnerability.
Right. Make it easier for your team to manage these applications.
That is reducing your attack surface by literally removing the feature that presents the vulnerability.
Good point. Good. And external parties.
Yeah, I should have mentioned the things that are italicized are the ones where James and I live and breathe, right? Places where the application of intelligence or intelligence products are forefront. Pen tests, bug bounties, and third-party assessments. These can range from, you know, the $500 automated scorecard to the in-depth hands-on assessment by a trained analyst or even a pen tester at the far end. And really that's going to depend on the criticality of the systems that you need assessed. You know, if the truth is you do all your ordering of coffee cups and toilet paper with an online system and that gets breached, someone might find out how many rolls of toilet paper you're using. Don't really care. If it's, you know, your critical suppliers log in and out of the system where you manage your inventory of parts for the stealth fighter, right? You probably want to put the full Monty on those systems.
Very good. And then, of course, common known exploits or attacks, maybe groups, organizations, tactics, all of that type of thing.
Yeah, and that's back to that indications and warning. That's that open source intelligence where I've spent a lot of my career, right, which is the notion that if you know how you and your peer companies and the actors that target them are acting, behaving, exploiting, breaching right now, it can significantly reduce your attack surface because you close the right holes in the right order with the scarce people you have who only have so many hours in the day.
Very good. All right, and so now the harder one.
Oh, boy.
Right, the attack surface, which is the human vulnerabilities. This is more of a culture training-esque, but there are things we can do, we can program in to help.
Absolutely. I mean, the first is least privilege.
Right.
I'm actually a fan of, as much as you can implement it the right ways in the right places, default deny rather than default allow. The idea that in many smaller organizations, right, you come on board and once you're hired, you have a login to the one network that everybody shares for everything. And that is, frankly, in this era, no way to run a railroad. Not so much because of insiders, which are certainly a concern, but because that insider's credentials or access or workstation having been compromised, you want to restrict the access you've now given to the bad actor.
Completely agree. So we've got PII down here and significant funds, so multiple approvals required, right? So essentially, you know, back to the whole who needs access, who do they ask, maybe a policy that sort of stipulates what things need to happen before you can release information, data, financial records.
Absolutely. This one was actually added in response. I mean, you know, this sounds like, oh, good theory. No, this was part of our reduce your attack surface in response to a huge trend right now. The CFO writes to accounting employee and says, I need all the W-2s before we send them out for tax season. Or, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of companies across North America are getting hit with this exact scam for fraudulent tax return filing.
The business email compromise.
Business email compromise, right? This is the low-tech, no-tech hack that simply social engineers. If every employee in finance is trained, you do not send this type of information without a second approval and an out-of-band confirmation that says pick up the phone and call your superior, right? There's a reason on a nuclear submarine that two people at opposite ends of the room have to turn the keys at the same time. Same idea here.
And so we've got define and enforce strong password policies. Everybody keeps talking about passwords all the time, but that's because it works, right?
Yeah, we've got an amazing link. We studied the 3 or 4 billion stolen passwords in our database. You know, cheesy movie reference, right? The back to Spaceballs. The most common password in 3 billion records is literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For those of you who get the joke, the point is that you cannot just define a strong password. You need special characters and a number and a lowercase and all of that. That has to be enforced on your systems. You can't just say that's a policy. Password reset. You can say you're supposed to reset every 90 days. Do your systems actually impose that? And most importantly, do you have the kind of application layer controls that recognize, for example, brute forcing? I cannot tell you how many web application vulnerability scans I have personally looked at where the scanner said, I tried 10 passwords in 8 seconds and wasn't blocked. And you just want to grab somebody by the neck and say, how can you not block that, right, at the application layer? The related piece is firms like ours have these compromised credentials. We get them. We work with customers on automated ways to validate them, get those data to the teams, or even better, to the systems that handle your identity and access management, and close the window fast. If that password is found and known and confirmed stolen, shut the window and shut it quick.
Right. And then again, aggressive and realistic social engineering training. I mean, this is one of these culture-related things that communicates to your employees. It's important to the company. We know what's happening. They've got an idea of what the risks are.
Absolutely. This is where that human layer, right, there's no patch Tuesday for the user. Right? You have got to train and test, and the techniques have to be kept up to date. They have to be the ones that are happening now. The techniques from 3 years ago aren't the ones that are getting used today. And you've got to not only train, but then test. We have some clients who run their own fish against their employees, and when the employees click something they shouldn't, they're immediately sent to traffic school, and they can't have their workstation back till they watch the 5-minute "Why did you click on that" video.
It's like Nigerian princes and being mugged in London, right? More realistic sort of business transactions.
That's right.
All right, so again, you sort of set us up a little bit, Eric, in regards to this is your extra tidbit for us, which is that attack surface is even bigger than we originally thought, right, as part of our presentation here. Once I steal those credentials, I can log into other environments that have my sensitive data that I don't control in regards to, I don't control the network, the application, or the people working there.
Absolutely, and this is, gratuitous tee-up for a future webinar, right? This all assumes, everything we've said in the last 38 minutes or whatever, it assumes that you actually have control over your network and the network environment, the applications, and the people in question. Problem is that, woe betide the person who stands in front of the CFO freight train and says, cost reduction or not, we're giving away too much control of our data. And they say, I can save 8% a year, get out of the way, right? One of the researchers on my team has a wonderful sticker on his computer. It says, there's no such thing as a cloud, it's just someone else's computer. And when all your HR material is in Workday, your pipeline is in Salesforce, all your sensitive data are on a Dropbox account, you don't actually have control of any of the things we've talked about today for where a lot of your critical information resides. And so third-party cyber risk is probably the largest part of your attack surface, both because one company has 100 other vendors that touch their sensitive data or systems, and you have the least control. Yes, you can send them an audit checklist and have them opine on or tell you what they do.
Right. Trust
but verify in alignment with the criticality of the vendor and their access. Automated scorecard for a lot of vendors is good. I want to crawl into your ear with a microscope and, physically walk through your facility at the other end. That vendor assessment has got to be in alignment with the level of risk that third party presents.
So again, once you've applied the disciplines correctly to your own organization that we've talked about in regards to reducing that attack surface, apply some of that same discipline to your vendors, right? Ask them the same questions you had to address or the problems you had to solve when you interact with them. Expect that.
That's exactly right. We have an offering where we do an attack surface assessment on our clients. The exact same offering except for the cover page,
names have changed to protect the innocent.
Exactly, is routinely turned by our customers, and they say, I need you to do this type of assessment on my 10 most critical vendors. And that process looks at, yes, it looks at application vulnerabilities. Yes, it looks at indicators of compromise, the traditional thing. But it looks at social engineering and spear phishing risk. It looks at your domain portfolio and whether you've reduced the attack surface on lookalikes. Are you blocking at the gateway? Are you looking for suspicious domain and trademark registrations? Are you aware of how many compromised credentials are out there? I had one company, we ran an assessment on the other day. I'll just close with this example. We found 1,278 compromised account credential records and 902 individual users in a company with 1,500 employees, meaning I had 60% of the workforce in a compromised account credentials database. Even if 1 in 10 of those is live, current, and real, I've got 90 user accounts that work in a company of 1,500 people.
Well, and again, even if they don't work, it's likely that one of those aspects have been used somewhere
else, and I'll try it on
Twitter
ADP.
or Facebook or ADP or any of them. So thank you very much, Eric, for walking us through this attack surface. Again, I'll open it up to questions for the audience, and while we're doing that, we're navigating so we can read some of these. Okay, just give me a moment. All right, so the first one is, okay, with limited time, money, and people, what should I start with first?
The basics. As I said, take that approach. The 80-20 rule really applies here. Most of these attacks are accomplished by things that are well known, by CVEs that have been out forever. Start with the absolute basics. Can you inventory your network? Do you know what's on it? Do you know what it's running? Have you patched the common most vulnerabilities? And the OWASP top 10 and NIST are a great place to start.
So I think you mentioned that social engineering training testing should reflect the most up-to-date tactics and types. How do we keep abreast of those? There
are a number of possibilities here. Gratuitous plug at the high end, if you will. There are folks who, including us, who will perform, who will deliver a report to you on, how this is being done. We can test phish. We can do the computer-based training for the employees, et cetera. That's a continuous awareness program with training where it's updated with, the latest phish of the month and how it's being done right now. The W-2 scam is this year's big problem for business email compromise, et cetera. At the other end, you can literally set up a news feed. Set yourself your Google News feed or your news alerts or a Facebook page that streams articles about the latest phishing and social engineering.
Well, I think the only thing I'll add to that too is to set up a culture within any business where those sorts of articles and bits of information can be distributed. So, because a lot of the control of the business is siloed. So these individual groups need to understand, right? Accounting and HR need to be abreast of the scams that are attacking them, not just the security people. Being the only ones that know about it in the organization.
Right? Given my druthers, nobody's going to target the smartest people in the room. Right. I mean, technologically speaking.
But how often should I assess my third-party vendors?
The answer, like the level of assessment and the level of spend you dedicated to it, is that it depends on the criticality of the vendor and the amount of access they have to your systems, your data, and how big a business risk they present. I would say for many, once or twice a year is fine, and a relatively straightforward automated scorecard type of application or service is often totally acceptable. The flip side is, for your critical vendors who can reach into your systems, who interact with your database, who have access to core technologies, right? The best answer there is continuous round-the-clock automated line speed monitoring. That's your threat intelligence integration with a good tip platform, round-the-clock, eyes on the glass, because that's the level of scrutiny that those risks warrant.
So opt for best in class, but start somewhere, right? Do something, right?
Something is better than nothing. Absolutely.
So do it once if you haven't done it at all. And one last question for you is, you mentioned where to find new exploits. Could you just repeat that again?
Yep. Yeah. We'll, I think we can send out a follow-up and thank you email. We'll try to get some of that in there. But the National Vulnerability Database at nvd.nist.gov. Exploit DB, the Microsoft Tech Center. You can just Google all of these. Also, many of the security vendors have a latest vulns, latest exploits page where they themselves publish or republish what they're seeing. Again, a quick Google search and some RSS or email signups, and you're off to the race.
And many vendors have them as well, as you mentioned earlier. All right, well, Eric, thank you very much again for everything and for the presentation today. Again, we'll have some follow-up materials, I'm sure, on our social media pages. Again, if you have any additional questions you'd like to submit to our team, please feel free to do so. We have a place on our website to do that. Again, look forward to our next webinar, as Eric said. So look out for that on Bright Talk. And with that, Dina, I'll pass it back over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen. It is fantastic to have you on today's presentation. You've given some very insightful tips and information on today's session. We appreciate that. And thank you to our audience today for viewing our live webcast. Please make note that we will post the recording of today's session on our resources page on our website, which is www.lookingglasscyber.com. And you also have access to our other recorded webinars through the Bright Talk platform at our Looking Glass channel. But again, thank you to our presenters. Thank you to Eric. Thank you to James. And if any of you out there, please contact us directly if you have additional questions. And thank you for viewing today. Have a great day.
Thank you all very much for your time. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.